Now, one thing that becomes important here is thinking about how gas actually works. So gas, unlike solids or liquids, is compressible. The amount of volume that gas takes up varies with the amount of pressure that it's getting. And that also means, so if you change the volume, you're going to change the pressure. If you change the pressure, it'll try to change the volume, but only if it can. So here we can see with, if you compact it to a smaller space, it's a higher pressure. Now, this is important for your lungs being able to inflate and deflate and move this air in and out. And so this takes place by this pressure moving air around. You can think about it the same as the way if you squeeze a balloon, it's going to push the air around. Now, for this air to move, it has to be able to get through. And just like resistance was important when we talked about blood pressure and blood flow, it's also important here. So higher resistance means that the pressure relative to the flow is higher. So higher pressure relative to flow. It means if you have higher resistance, the same amount of pressure is going to result in less flow. And we can see the resistance in different areas. So in it's highest in these bronchi here, and then when you get out to further out, you see lower resistance. However, the resistance can change. Whenever our airways constrict, that is going to increase resistance. And also, if there's inflammation with thickened arterial wall, that causes increased resistance. And extra mucus can also cause increased resistance. Now, the real problem is when you look at like asthma, where the muscles are constricting, so you're getting a very narrowed airway, and there's also inflammation, and this can actually then block the airway or cause so much resistance that very little air is able to get through. But this brings us back to these respiratory pressures. So changes in respiratory pressure are what actually cause the flow of air in and out of the lungs. So the way that this happens is that your diaphragm contracts, and that contraction pulls your lungs down, opening up sort of the pleural cavity, making there be more volume. Now, if there's more volume, that means there's going to be less pressure. And so now you have a lower pressure area in the lungs, and that lower pressure area is going to pull air from the outside environment down all those upper respiratory pathways that we looked at into the lungs. And then it will equalize the pressure. And then your diaphragm relaxes. That makes that cavity smaller, so less volume, and that decrease in volume is going to increase the pressure, and as long as there's a pathway for it to go out, that air will go out. Now you can sort of really become aware of this if you hold your nose and close your mouth and try to breathe in and out. Do that for a moment. You'll feel that pull on that, inside your chest, where you can feel your diaphragm moving, and there's that tension. That's the pressure trying to pull, that normally would pull the air in. Now, there is one complication here, which is one of the things that your body has to work against here is the surface tension in the alveoli. Now, remember, water has a very high surface tension from all that hydrogen bonding. So water has a tendency to stick together. Now, your alveoli, of course, have this wet lining from that's the cell membranes there. And this means that it's basically a little bubble that tends to pull closed. Now we have a couple of things that we do to prevent that. One is simply just keeping some air in there all the time. As long as there's some air, it's harder for that bubble to pull closed, and so that prevents it from collapsing. Now the other one is surfactant. Surfactant is really important, and this decreases surface tension. The type of surfactant that you're probably most familiar with is soap. Soap is a surfactant. If you think about the difference between how water looks if it's on your arm without soap versus when you're washing your hands and the soap makes it, so without soap it's going to form little droplets, right? But with soap, if you're washing your hands, you're going to see this smooth layer. That's because we're reducing surface tension with that surfactant. So your lungs produce surfactant, and that reduces surface tension, making it easier for the alveoli to stay open and to open more. Now, also, we have to think about dead space. So the alveoli have this gas exchange, right, between the air in the alveolus and the capillary, and we'll talk a lot more about that as we go on. But here we're looking at dead space where there's gas in the alveoli, but not, or gas in the area, but not blood flow passing through. We have anatomic dead space, and this is all of the airways that lead to the alveoli. These never have gas exchange. This is part of the anatomy. There's alveolar dead space, ventilated areas in the lungs without blood flow. Now this, under normal conditions at rest, this exists at least to some degree. Some parts of the lungs are getting a lot less blood flow, and some parts of the lungs are getting less air, and that's just sort of the extra capacity that you have to increase this when you need to. We can also talk about mechanical dead space if you're using artificial airways and ventilators and things like that. Now this, all of this movement allows us to look at the amount of air that you're breathing in. So when you're just sitting there breathing at rest normally as you're watching this video, the inhalation and exhalation that you're doing right now is your tidal volume. Now, that's just your normal breathing range. It's where you are by default. Now, take a big deep breath. That all the way in is your inspiratory capacity. So that's your tidal volume plus your inspiratory reserve volume, and that full range is your inspiratory capacity. Now go back to breathing normally for a moment, and then breathe out as far as you can. Everything extra you got rid of there is your expiratory reserve volume. That's the extra air you can breathe out. Now you'll notice on this figure, there's also a residual volume. That's the volume of air in your lungs that is always there, that's necessary to keep your alveoli open and prevent them from collapsing there. Now if you breathe all your air out, then take a big deep breath and then breathe it out again. Try that. That is your vital capacity. That is the maximum amount that you can breathe in, maximum amount that you can breathe out, and that is that vital capacity with the residual, and you add the residual volume to that, and that is the total lung capacity, the full amount that your lungs can hold. So we can see that, here we're just looking at the tidal volume breathing, the inspiratory reserve volume, the expiratory reserve volume, the residual volume. In a normal semester, we would actually do this in lab. Unfortunately, we can't because we're not in lab, but I want you to still get the feeling of how these lung volumes play out and how they feel in your breath. Now, of course, if you lose that residual capacity, we call that a collapsed lung. That means that your alveoli don't have air left, they've collapsed, and when that happens, the lung pulls away from the lining of the pleural cavity, and the surface tension makes it really, really hard to reopen it. Usually we have to go in and mechanically reopen that collapsed lung.
So to do that, there are some we have some important muscles acting here. We have the diaphragm, which contracts